Hello and welcome to everyone. We are so excited you could all be here for today's webinar. My name is Mary Mall. I am the Graduate Assistant for the Zehr Institute, and I will be going over our agenda as well as helping with this online platform. We will begin with our host, DeMointe, introducing our guest speakers. After the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, which will be moderated by our host. After the Q&A portion is concluded, I will share a few announcements related to the Zehr Institute and the Center for Justice and Peace Building. Then the webinar will be closed out with remarks provided by DeMointe. We hope you are all able to stay until the end, but if you cannot, there will be a recording of this webinar posted on the Zehr Institute's website and YouTube channel by early next week if you'd like to watch it again or share it with others. For today's webinar, comments and questions may be submitted through the comments section on the platform you are using. Our host will be facilitating the Q&A portion after the presentation. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. Now I'm going to pass to DeMointe.
Thanks so much, Mary. I'm DeMointe Wesley. I am a student at the Center for Justice and Peace Building and a graduate student for the Zehr Institute. I have the pleasure of introducing all of our wonderful guest speakers today, starting off with Joan Pennell. Joan is Professor Emerita of Social Work at North Carolina State University and was the founding director of the Center for Family and Community Engagement. She has conducted research on restorative justice, family violence, child welfare, and fathering. She has a long-term commitment to social justice movements for gender, racial, indigenous, economic, and environmental justice. Please welcome Joan. Hi, Joan. Next up, we have Donna Coker. Donna is professor of law at University of Miami. Her research concerns the connection between economic vulnerability and IPV, restorative justice responses to IPV, and sexual harm, and the intersections of gender and race subordination and criminal law doctrine, policy, and application. And IPV there is interpersonal violence. Welcome, Donna. And then we have Mimi Kim. Mimi is Associate Professor of Social Work at California State University at Long Beach and the Editor-in-Chief of Affiliate. She is a longtime anti-domestic violence advocate in Asian immigrant and refugee communities and remains active in the promotion of community organizing, community accountability, and transformative justice approaches to violence intervention and prevention. Thank you so much for being here, Mimi. So to get us started, I wanted to first start with Joan, who has authored a wonderful book on restorative justice approaches to family violence. So Joan, if you could start us off with just a brief overview of the book and some of the grounding frameworks that the book covers.
Well, first, I just want to thank the Zehr Institute for this invitation. I was thrilled that Howard Zehr suggested this presentation. And then I couldn't do it alone. I really had to do it with my two good friends, Donna Coker and Mimi Kim. And they're such smart, ingenious women, and you'll love hearing from them. A restorative approach to family violence, Feminist Kin-Making, is not what I originally intentioned to call the book. My intent was to say first Feminist Kin-Making and then a restorative approach to family violence. The publisher, Routledge, gently nudged me to reverse the order because they knew readers would want to know what it's all about. So I reversed the order. Where did this all come out of, the book? About 30 years ago, myself and my friend Gail Burford did an early demonstration of what we called family group decision-making in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And it was we invited, they accepted the invitation, 3 very diverse communities. One was Inuit, one was rural, and it was a wonderful mix of Francophone, Anglophone, and Micmac. And then the third was the urban center, the capital, English and Irish. Uh, they also were at about the furthest points away from each other possible. Gail Burford pointed it out to me later. But what we found was it worked in all 3 communities, and it worked with very intense situations of family violence, because we had asked for that to be the focus of the project, and we certainly got those referrals. Now, in the early days, the theory that I proposed and others agreed with me was to say, well, it worked because it widens the circle. It widens the circle of care and protection around people. I still love that model. But when I was looking back 30 years later at what we had done, what I learned from the work in North Carolina, what I learned from working with other countries, is it didn't explicitly state the theory of feminist intersectionality. And I've already mentioned these were very diverse communities, and in each place, how they carried it out was quite different, and it needed to be, because they were shaping it to their families. Now, the theory that, well, before I go on any further, I just want to say, when I'm using the word family violence, I don't mean between 2 people. I mean the whole larger family group. And family group includes those by marriage, genetics, convention, but it's also chosen family. And they come within the home, there is a basic violation of trust against both children and adults. But family violence, in my head and with those with whom I worked, was never simply about what happens in families. It was about how social structures shape what happens in families. And there we get into intersections of race and gender and ability and sexuality, and on I can go. Now, at the time, I thought that family violence would be the most severe test of carrying out a family-based, community-led, really, approach. And looking back, what I realized, it doesn't work in all situations, but it is amazingly successful. And this was not what I expected to learn. And why would that be? And that's where I started thinking through a theory of feminist kin-making. And it's what I saw happening in so many situations in Canada, in the US, and elsewhere. And what is feminist kin-making? Remember, that's what I really wanted to call the book, right at the very top line. Well, first off, it's feminist. So it comes out of the women's movement in so many different countries. And it is also, though, to maintain its principles of equity, must affiliate with other emancipatory movements, such as labor, peace, environment, and so on. So that's the first part. Second part is kin-making. So that's about reworking relationships to be caring and just. And what it's really about is seeing others uh, in relationship to oneself and as persons. And it's the reverse of what the Martinique colonization critic Aimé Césaire referred to as thingification. So it's the opposite of turning people into things, or animals into things, or land into things. And the other part, though, is that it's not about assuming because you're doing a conference that you're keeping a couple together. That was never the intent. It does happen some of the time, but it's really about bringing people together into their wider family, cultural network with support of community around them. Third, and this puts the pieces back together, it's feminist kin-making. And so this means that you don't leave families to swim or sink on their own. If they could have swam, they would have done it from the outset. Instead, it's about working with families to build in the kinds of supports and protections that they want, not what the criminal legal system or the child welfare system or educational systems impose in terms of regulating families. But what I've found over and over is it creates cascades. So if you start one thing that, such as a mother getting employment training, a child getting counseling around having witnessed so much violence, that can set off a whole stream of other very positive cascades. And I'll stop at that point because I want Donna and Mimi to talk. They have good things to share.
Thank you so much, Joan. You gave us so much to think about. And I hope a little bit later we can talk more about just what, just and caring relations looks like as it relates to working with family violence. But I want to invite Donna and Mimi in to talk a little bit more about your work around family violence. Where do each of you enter into this conversation and work around family violence? And we'll start off with Donna.
Thank you, Demonte, and to the Zehr Institute for being here, and Joan for inviting me to join her. It's really a pleasure to be here to highlight this important work that Joan has done and to share my thoughts. So I entered this work, I suppose, from back in 1978 when I first started working in a shelter in Little Rock, Arkansas. And have been doing what we would then have called domestic violence work, or at the time I started, it was called the Battered Women's Movement. Those are terms that I don't use now, but I did then. And I did that, and then I worked in a community program in Hawaii, and I worked in legal services for a while in Little Rock as well, working with survivors. And I became concerned then that too frequently what we were providing had an implicit message that survivors would need to leave their families, their communities, that they couldn't get support. The assumption, not universally, but too frequently, was that they couldn't get support in their communities, and there was not as much attention to the kind of transformative possibilities that Joan was just talking about. I also became, and that concern increased over time. I also became concerned about the way in which the criminal system had become so central to so much of the work that was happening in the anti-violence movement, that I knew from my own experience that many survivors really had no interest in punishment. They wanted the violence to stop, but they didn't think the criminal system had much to offer them. I also became increasingly concerned and more aware, frankly, of the reach of mass incarceration and the reach of the criminal system in very pernicious and pervasive ways, and particularly concerned about the ingrained racism of the system. This led me to some research on the Navajo Nation peacemaking. I had the good fortune to become acquainted with former Justice Ray Austin, and have been allowed to do some research on peacemaking. And what I found in that research was that a very significant number of the folks who used peacemaking in cases that involved family violence or intimate partner violence were women survivors who came to peacemaking as a way to end their relationship. That certainly wasn't everybody, but it was a significant number. And they wanted help to do that. I saw the potential in peacemaking for the space to recognize the impact of subordinating systems, of structures, as Joan was just talking about, that maintain and sustain violence, the impact of past trauma and abuse in the life of a person who commits harm. I saw the ability to both speak to that in ways that didn't in turn blame the survivor or diminish the harm the survivor had experienced. And it seemed to me that those were critical to true transformation and critical to better meeting the needs of survivors. So over time, I became increasingly concerned and aware that the warnings that came from left feminists, from women of color, Beth Ritchie comes to mind, for example, about the ways in which the criminal system deepens the very conditions that create more interpersonal violence and is itself, of course, the site for very significant violence. So finally, I think that what I began to refer to as crime logic had become the equivalent very frequently in many circumstances with feminist logic. That was true certainly historically in the intimate partner violence space, and I'll talk in a second about what's changing there. But you could see it in the Me Too kinds of responses as well. And by crime logic, I mean several things, but one key thing is a simplistic idea about human conduct and about how violence happens, and inattention to structures and inattention to those social conditions. So you saw those two websites that popped up at the beginning of my talk. One is for a 2015 survey that I and several others did in concert with the ACLU. We surveyed more than 900 service providers in the country about their experiences with policing around domestic violence and sexual harm. And we heard from many of them, a very significant number about police bias, about bias on the basis of race, certainly anti-Black bias, also bias against poor women, bias against survivors or anyone they suspected were drug users, extreme bias against sex workers or those they perceive to be sex workers. 46% of respondents said that police acted in demeaning ways, and 30% said they acted in demeaning ways. Sometimes 30% said often, so we're talking about 76%, who describe the police behavior frequently to be demeaning. And finally, where I enter, I think, is this. I've seen these changes in the restorative justice movement towards a greater centrality on racial justice. I trace the impact in the RJ movement from the greater centrality leadership, and I don't want to overstate this, of people of color in that movement, the inclusion of more incarcerated, formerly incarcerated individuals, the work in the school systems that has focused on disrupting racial discriminatory practices and the greater centrality of Indigenous work. But that there have been significant changes, in my view, in sectors of the restorative justice movement. At the same time, changes in the feminist anti-violence movement. Again, I am at risk of overstating, but there, as Mimi has written so well about, sectors of that movement, and again, very much influenced by organizations like Insight and others led by women of color, have really created a new, what Mimi describes as an anti-carceral feminism. And it's in that moment, that intersection, in which I suppose at this moment I enter and place my work. So I'll turn it to Mimi.
Yeah, thank you so much, Donna, and thank you for introducing us to that phrase, anti-carceral feminism. And it's so appropriate to invite Mimi in to talk about where you enter this work around family violence.
Yeah, hello everybody. Good morning. I'm in California, so it is still morning here. I also want to thank the Zehr Institute that's been such a leader in restorative justice, and my good friends Joan and Donna, who I was really thinking I've known now. Joan, maybe 20 years. Donna, just a little tiny bit less than that. So we have been colleagues, friends, comrades for quite a while. So, but I'm not sure that the three of us have been on a webinar together like this. So this is really an exciting opportunity. Thanks for bringing us together, everybody who has. In answering that story or that question, I think all of us, I have a few years in the game, as many of us do. So I have to say that I really started more like actual paid labor work in the anti-violence sector or movement back in the late 1980s. At that time, there were really few women of color, very few Asian American women, Asian women that were working in the field, and really entered at a time when there were so few options for many of us in communities of color. I mean, that sadly that remains the case for so many people. But I spent a lot of my time then really making allies with and fighting for more appropriate and more responses for immigrant communities, for people of color, and so on. So I started at that time, and I was really fortunate to start a Korean hotline in Chicago, which still exists today. I actually started in sexual assault and was going to different immigrant communities, Asian immigrant communities, and talking about sexual violence in those various places in Chicago. And I started a Korean hotline in Chicago, and later found myself at Asian Women's Shelter in San Francisco, where I worked for 10 years in a shelter that was established to serve an Asian immigrant community. And so I realized that for a lot of time, I was really fighting for relevant, community-based, community organizing type approaches and formations really to serve our communities. But I also came to find that the ways in which I had been trained and oriented towards looking at violence, family violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, was in a particular kind of white Western approach that really saw separation and kind of this autonomy for women and maybe women with their children to be kind of the model for the ways in which you would escape violence. And that we saw families actually as being the location of the problem and not the location for the solution. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that specifically in answering the question that you had just mentioned earlier, Demoites. So, but that gave me a little of a backdrop in thinking about the ways in which we were able to create programming that was so relevant to and spoke to the many, many, I would say mostly women and children and families that we served, but also the ways in which they were so limited. At the same time, I think a lot of people here know a lot of people are drawn to restorative justice because it is an alternative in terms of philosophy, framework, practices, and policies to the kind of retributive law enforcement system that we have. And certainly for me, I think a moment of great awakening was in 1994, when I was working at the shelter. I knew a lot of people that were fighting for the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, of 1994. And what I didn't realize at the time, until really, I think the time that it passed, was that it was passed as part of the crime bill. And I was really quite appalled and honestly shocked when I realized that our ties with law enforcement were so close that we would tie a policy that, that right now we celebrate to one that I was so opposed to. And that was the crime bill, which was so kind of pernicious in the history of what many people now call mass incarceration. Or hyper incarceration in the United States, and something that sadly we've exported to a lot of different parts of the globe. I think that was something I was aware of, but at that time it became a crystallizing moment for me that we really had to do something different. It was also a moment in which I realized that we as a movement, that I considered my movement, a liberatory feminist movement, had been so tied to law enforcement that people did not even talk about or openly oppose the fact that VAWA was passed as part of the crime bill. So that silence was also shocking. And I think it was at that time that I remember talking more openly with different people that I knew nationally and locally, and there weren't a lot. To talk about how really appalled we were, to talk about what we could do as an alternative, how we could take a movement that we really embraced as our own, but call out the movement and see what else we could do. I would say after that, there were small ways and big ways that some of us had done so, and some of us knew each other across different programs. I hadn't been in Chicago, and I actually knew Beth Ritchie from the time that I was in Chicago, and she had just entered living there at the time. And of just a few people, we were all hungrily reading Kimberly Crenshaw's piece on intersectionality, which really spoke to us. And a few of us kept talking, and what that resulted in was the formation in 2000 of Insight, which thank you, Donna, for mentioning. It was certainly for me personally was really a critical formation and time in my life where I saw, we thought maybe 200 people would come to our kind of founding gathering, and it gave us an excuse to be together. But we found that over 2,000 people were trying to get in. We couldn't let everybody in, but that really signaled to us that there was a hunger for and a timing for a kind of an alternative movement that really looked at a different way of looking at the power and the needs and the perspectives of women of color. At that time, we focused on women of color. I think since that time have really expanded our notion of gender and our relationship to also to people who identify as masculine. But it was really, I've continued to talk to so many people who I didn't even know at that time who found either that were fortunate enough to make it to that space, or have been influenced from that space and have gone to gatherings since and just been part of that work. That was a time when we could very openly talk about the relationship between gender-based violence, family violence, intimate partner violence, interpersonal violence, and state violence, which we saw as perpetrated in large part by the system of policing, prisons, jails, and so on itself. And that was something that had been done on the margins before. I want to thank Critical Resistance for having their founding conference in 1998 and being very, very influential. I was fortunate to be at that one as well. And I think that we've had since then a real intersection of different kinds of movements that some of which Joan was mentioning, but also I think that was strongly influenced by what we now know as abolition feminism or abolitionist feminism. I would urge you all to read the book that recently came out by Angela Davis, Beth Ritchie, and others that kind of celebrate the history of that work and show the influence of feminism on what many people now know as abolition. Feminism and the work that many of us in this very Zoom room have done and celebrated and read and contributed to has been very influential. And I think a notion of abolition that's not only about dismantling jails and prisons, but that's about building the world that we want. And I probably have gone on so long now. I'm going to try to shorten this by talking about my own efforts in 2004 to really try to see what does it look like to have an approach to family violence, to intimate partner violence, to sexual violence that doesn't actually call upon the state, that may not even use kind of your traditional direct services approach, but that actually turns towards family members, towards community members, towards friends, allies, to come up with a solution to violence. And that's certainly when I learned about the work of Joan Pennell and Gail Burford, and was so excited that I had a chance to go to Durham, where Joan lives, and I'm sure I called you up or emailed you or something and asked if I could meet with you. And I was so hungry to hear more about the restorative approach. Creative Interventions was the organization I started. That was in 2004, but I think one of the slides had the fact that the book that came out of really a kind of pilot experimental period is still out there and just got published in a hard copy, beautiful form. The last couple of years was the toolkit, and then a accompanying workbook, which you'll see in that teal green, came out last year out of AK Press. You can get it at all the sites where you usually get books, and we have them for free always on our website. So, and the workbook is even in a Google Doc form, so you could just take it and adapt it and use it in whatever way makes sense for you and your family and your people as you're moving forward trying to interrupt violence. More recently, I actually had a chance to get together with Sujata Baliga, which I know that everybody's quite familiar with, and went knocking on the doors again of Joan and Gail, who came out and gave us a training and really helped influence our fledgling non-law enforcement restorative justice program called Collective Healing and Transformation now, or CHAT Project, to really try this out in using, I think, that a method that's more familiar to people in restorative justice. I myself come more from the transformative justice tradition, which I can talk about later. And we finally got to the point where we felt like we could actually publicize some of the findings that we had from the beginning parts of our work, and it's still in implementation stage. So I want to thank Joan so much for really bringing in the importance of children in particular to the kind of restorative justice work. I don't know that we would have done it without that kind of, strong message that we got from Joan and from Gail. And Donna's been also supporting us through looking at the evaluation that you see on the slide right now. I'm going to stop there. Apologize for going for so long. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Mimi. I don't think anyone is upset to hear all of that wisdom. Thank you each for sharing all of the resources and history that you have shared. Each of you in your sharing sort of talked about how a lot of your work is around expanding the constellations of care when it comes to approaching family violence, right? Moving away from maybe systems or approaches that hyper focus on separation or leaving communities, separating from families, to think about how to really turn to broader constellations of care, communities of care. And so with that in mind, I'd like to turn to our sort of second question, which is, from your perspective, from the perspective of your work and your history, what do just relations and care really look like regarding work around family violence? And I think, yeah, we'll start with Joan to maybe give a bit more context there, and then turn it back over to Donna and Mimi.
I just want to back up a little bit, DeMointe. I love the question you're asking. What I didn't share is how I got into all of this. And a lot of it has to do with my Quaker heritage. So I've often felt quite an affinity with Mennonites. But it was a belief that people can come together in a unity of spirit. And that was really behind someone who had been so involved with what Donna and I called the Battered Women's Movement. I helped to set up the first shelter for abused women and their children in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And Mimi, what I didn't think was that the women were going to be coming with children. So we had to scramble quickly to make it a place where women and children and young people could be. I also had worked in child welfare in Toronto. And so, Donna, when you speak about crime logic, I've always loved that phrase of yours. But what I was learning as a child welfare worker is I really didn't like the logic of child protection. It was physically making me ill. And so, and I'd often go to households and find that women were seen as neglecting their children, while the night before they were beaten over the head with a lamp base. And what do you do then? So when I got moved from Toronto to St. John's, Newfoundland, it made so much sense to me to be figuring out other ways of supporting what I hadn't thought of, but one of my Canadian friends pointed out was a child welfare system in which women and children stayed together. So there was not that separation happening. I also facilitated groups for women who had been abused, who were of European and Indigenous descent. The women who were leaving the shelter were so scared about being out in the community without the connections. And so I was also learning with many others that we had to think beyond the doors of the shelter. And another piece of all this is when I went back to get my doctorate, it was looking at structures for shelters for abused women and their children. And there was one up in Saskatchewan, which was really a labor union model, where staff and the board made decisions together. There was another one in Pennsylvania that was a sisterhood model. And this was very different models. They both had great strengths, they both had weaknesses, but it also made me very aware that we need to figure out what are the systems and supports we have in place. In terms of the question that De Mointe was kind of nudging us toward is, what do caring and just relations look like? And when I was talking about Zehr, thingification, it's about living in community and being together. But how does that happen? And how does it happen when you're coming out of the context of family violence? And all of the communities that I mentioned that we were doing the work in Canada, but then later in North Carolina, were all very exploited communities. But they knew how to take charge of things. That goes back to that Quaker faith. And that people can really pull it together. But what is important, and this is what, and I'll give you an example if you'll all bear with me, of a family in Newfoundland where it was intergenerational violence. It was very deep-seated. The father came from a very large family where the father had abused everyone. We don't know what his history was, but we can only imagine. The mother came from a family that was much more close-knit, but they were being threatened by the father whenever they would support his wife and children. And the two sons were just terrified of the father, particularly the eldest. And the father was incarcerated in part because of the violence, but just other criminal activities. And at the conference, it was a huge number that came from his family because his mother had told them to be there and they listened to her. Her husband showed up too. With some encouragement and support, the mother's family came. And the son, the eldest son, was asked if he wanted to come. He chose not to, but he chose to write a letter to send to the conference. And the letter had such an incredible impact because he was talking about being really scared when his father would get out of prison. He was scared that he would get back with his mother. And this, his family had been really pressuring her to reunite with their son, brother, when he got out of prison. And prison is really not a good place to learn how to get along with other people. And her family didn't want her anywhere near him. But when the son's letter was read out, the family, all of them were able to feel it. And it's something I want to point out about children. The child was really the only one who was related to everyone who was in that large circle. And at that point, his family said no child should have to be so scared, and remember what their own histories were. And they also, behind the scenes, not where, and I'll call him the patriarch of the family, would hear, say no woman should be treated that way. Now, and I talked earlier about cascades, something small. Well, the letter really cascaded. And there's a number of things that, in the book I lay this out, I call it 4 narrative threads in terms of feminist kin-making. The first is family leadership. And having at the conference far more family there than service providers was key. Another aspect was expressing feelings, and the child's letter really made it so that people could express their feelings more. And then another third part I call responsive regulation. This is off of the work in Australia by John Braithwaite and others in regards to you don't get rid of all the external protections and supports, but what you do is you have them on the side to be called upon when they are wanted and needed. And that is so different than the crime logic that Donna was talking about, or Mimi that you were seeing in terms of the experiences of the women that you talked with. And then the fifth was really about the cascading out peace and nonviolence. And I just want you to think about a child writing a letter that was read before all of his large family group, taking a stance against family violence. And that speaks of what helps to create caring and just relationships. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that framing, Joan. And I really want to highlight, the restorative part of restorative approaches to family violence, feminist kin-making, the focus on needs, the material needs, right? The material supports is a crucial part of restorative justice. So thank you for speaking to that as well. I'll turn it over to Donna or Mimi. I'll let you decide who wants to go first around this question of, from your perspective, what do just relations and care look like and require in this work?
You want to go first, maybe? No, okay. No problem. I want to pick up where Joan left off. The cascade, as she described, this moment, which I'm not sure, I think it's a small moment, I think it was a huge moment, where the child's letter was read and the impact it had on the family, that the intergenerational kind of impacts of harm and the ripple effect of recognizing the wisdom of that child's statement on those, I think captures the value of restorative processes in a really poignant way. There's another aspect in Joan's description that I think is important to me, and that is the way in which the family group decision-making had an impact on the system of child welfare. So, and some of that was about changing the biases that the social workers had, that Joan began with from her experience, right? Changing the ways in which the social workers, the state social workers who saw the families and their work. And I think the obvious from a systems point of view, which is where I think I'm going to take my response to this question. The obvious impact of family group decision-making is that it has, as is true, I think, in the claims for restorative justice that are system-based, whether it's the criminal justice system or other systems, other formal governing systems, is ameliorative. It also, and that's not insignificant, right? That it was, by not removing children, it ameliorated the harms of removing children by taking the family's abilities and resources seriously and giving support for that, it had better outcomes, as Joan and Gail's research shows, in terms of child welfare, in terms of harms to the child. I think that the question that that I posed to a group of folks doing restorative justice, that in programs that are what I've termed system-based, again, meaning that the outcome of the restorative process by design has an impact on on the state's governing of that family or that individual. So if it's diversion out of the criminal system, it's by intention is supposed to have an impact on sentencing, et cetera. And the same thing is true in child welfare system, is whether those processes could ever be liberatory. And I'm not sure I like the fact that I use that word. I'm not sure that's the right word. But Joan asked me to talk about that. And I guess what I mean by that is really two things. One is what I've already suggested, and that is, can restorative justice have an impact on the systems of which it's a part? So it's not a new question, and it's not a new concern that restorative justice, and this is, the concern is beyond net widening. The concern is when restorative processes begin to, as did feminist practices, begin to mirror the values of the system that they're attached to, right? The other concern is not just in the process, but that, for example, Talia Gonzalez's look at restorative justice programs that are attached to criminal processes finds that there's an increasing number that are used as that are referrals that and the fines and fee problems that you're finding in all the other kinds of deferments from prosecution are cropping up in restorative justice, so that now people have to pay for it, and if they don't pay for it, that can become the basis for either returning or failure to have completed the program. So then they go back and they have to complete a sentence. So that kind of entanglement is really not captured by the net widening concern that I think we talked about a generation back, right, in restorative justice, that kind of entanglement. So those are the ways that I think about this question of just relations and care. I think about where restorative justice enters. I think about whether systems-based programs can do. I completely believe that there's value in amelioration, but when does it cease to be ameliorative, and when does it start to be anti-liberatory, if you will? And then I think about the second order of change, and that is the degree to which Fania Davis talks about in the context of school restorative justice. When is it organizing, right? When is it both attention to the needs of the families in the circle or in the meeting at the conference, but when is it also changing the structures that that brought them there? So those are really the questions, and I probably have already talked too much. I'm going to stop and turn it over to Mimi, but those are the questions with which I really engage and am concerned about, and find actually great hope in the work that Joan so well describes in the book. This is very much a systems-based program, to use the language that I just described, that I think does perhaps not change the large structure of child welfare, but does have an impact, certainly an impact on that family, but some impact in terms of changing the way in which the system understands what they're doing. So I'm going to stop there and give it to Mimi, and maybe we can talk more about this.
Yeah, thank you, Donna. And that point about RJ's entanglement versus this question of net widening, I think it's a really interesting conversation. I hope we can talk more about that. Mimi, the same question to you. And I know that when we were talking about this question, maybe last week, you had maybe some reservations. I hope you will bring some of that into your response as well. But again, to you, what do just relations and care really look like and require in this work?
Thank you, Demointe, and thanks, Donna, for taking that first. We kind of practiced in order, and I was like, no, not me yet. So now I'm ready. And thank you, Demointe. We were discussing this question, and I think the word "just" brought in justice, and I was thinking, how am I going to answer that? Because it's not a framework that I use very much. And thank you, Demointe, for inviting me then to talk about that as a response to the question itself. And for a long time, I mean, insofar as I do call the work that I do now transformative justice, that was a bit of a journey. I would say that when I first started doing the work with creative interventions, which is when seriously decided to not only talk about like a framework or a politic around what anti-carceral or abolitionist feminism, that I actually thought if we can't actually do this on the ground, then I wouldn't say it's meaningless, but I mean, that's really where we can make those changes, that we actually do practices, we actually see what does this actually look like. And of course, domestic violence, family violence, sexual violence was already an area that I was really, really interested in, invested in, felt really drawn to, for many, many different reasons. I think there's a way in which also so many times when we look at this form of violence, we're looking at the complications of violence that takes place among people that you care about and love. And I think the word justice has always been something that I didn't feel comfortable with. And many of my peers, I think, also didn't, because it became so tied to the notions of a criminal justice system that people really had a hard time, and I think continue to have a hard time disentangling themselves from thinking that justice has to mean, I mean, it's just so, so pervasive, so hegemonic in the United States and the Western world that justice means something tied to, courts and prisons and police. And so it's so easy to think that something that might be different or alternative, like restorative justice or transformative justice, would take that very system and then make changes within that system. I was one, and I continue to be one that's opposed to that. I have seen over and over again, in looking historically at the movement that I feel very much a part of, that this is a game that we will never win. That part of the state is too powerful, that there is, I mean, we could just look in terms of the money that goes to really restorative justice work. There's a little bit more now, and we have to be very wary of that money. Transformative justice and the enormous billions and billions and billions of dollars that go every year to law enforcement. There is a huge, I think many people who started getting into defund the police, which I know is, I know there's a huge backlash against that right now, but only then discovered that even within city and local governments, you had 1/3 to 1/2 of the budget easily going to law enforcement, where you think it's going to everything else, education, health, and so on. This is our society, the state, our money, and our logic, as Donna was pointing out, is so, the ties to law enforcement ways of thinking and doing is so strongly, the pull is so strong that we that have been part of what I think more familiarly known as transformative justice have been very adamant in our development of frameworks, practices, policies that are outside of law enforcement and are opposed to law enforcement. Restorative justice has, I think a more kind of vexed, if you want to call it, relationship to that. You would be in a better position to understand that than I am, because I haven't been so much under that, I think, in the past few years, because I've been looking at the chat project, as I was talking about. We've been strongly saying we're non-law enforcement, and we have been since the beginning, and want to see what some of the kind of frameworks and practices more developed within a kind of restorative justice lineage bring to the community. It's been a fascinating journey for me. I know there's many, many things that are called restorative justice, some that look very, very different from each other. And again, I really thank Joan, in particular, Joan and Gail, for understanding what our project was, for supporting it, even if their own trajectory has been a different one. It's been really such a beautiful and productive kind of relationship that we've had. So still today, I do say transformative justice, but the concept of justice is one that I still do not feel comfortable talking about. I think what we found in the chat project is we first call ourselves something like Community Restorative Justice Solutions. It was a quickie term that somebody came up with, emphasizing community. But in doing so, we found that a lot of community members just were, if they came so far as to actually meet with us when we said restorative justice, they were not comfortable with the term. Particularly people, I think, in the Latinx community or Spanish speaking, that term just immediately, really, you had to spend so much time explaining, no, we don't mean that really the decision was to not even call the program restorative justice anymore, because we could just bypass all the explanations and possibly all the people that would never even call or come to the office because they would be so fearful of the tie to justice. Now, that does not mean I commend people to be grappling with the term justice. It's not, I want to listen to those arguments. I definitely, since I have an audience here, I think what we've been seeing now is a lot of the, Joan and Donna know very, very well that the anti-violence feminist field has been extremely opposed to any kind of restorative justice. And that's only in very recent years that, Joan and Gail were really against, they were in an era that when people didn't talk about it at all. And even now it's a struggle. But what we do see is now VAWA has a little pilot program, restorative justice, or alternatives that they explicitly say are non-law enforcement. But I have to say that I don't trust that a Violence Against Women Act and an Office of Violence Against Women that's centered right within Department of Justice is going to be able to keep away the forces that would that will start creeping into and making its way into restorative justice. I see right now that, for example, in the state of California, our state office that funds a lot of domestic violence and sexual assault programs did put out an RFP for restorative justice, but they explicitly said it has to be prosecutor oriented. So we see ways in which people have been kind of drawn to restorative justice in anew as a resistance to the kind of police violence that that became so prominent nationally and globally in the summer of 2020, but do not have the kind of discernment, I think, to think that what does it mean when then you increasingly state that these kinds of practices have to be in relationship with, or even like centered in, initiated by law enforcement. I think this is very dangerous. And I think what it does is I think it's a way in which the system is going to try to keep things in its sphere so that we still give money to and legitimize law enforcement by allowing it to have a kinder face of restorative justice. And it's going to squeeze out, I think, the opportunities for really truly community-driven kind of efforts to flourish, to be legitimized, to be funded, to be recognized. And so I wasn't planning on stating that so strongly today, but I felt a need to do so in talking about justice. Those are just the things that come up. And I am increasingly, I shouldn't be surprised because I saw this coming, but I still am surprised when I actually see this legislation coming out. And oh my gosh, here and there and everywhere where it's very explicitly, in fact, in the county where we have the chat project, Chelsea Miller, who's from the chat project, went and did a beautiful and brilliant kind of plug for restorative justice in front of the city council. And what did they do? They approved a measure that would give funding, or the county, approved a measure that would give funding only if you were going to train police officers and district attorneys. And there was nothing else left in that budget except for that. So that just was, I'm just saying that you could say in general, there's co-optation, but in practice, this is what it actually looks like. And it is, I think, scary, appalling, and something that I really hope those of you who are in the restorative justice world can resist. I want to go on to the care part of that, which is that care is also not a term that I've used so much. I've used the term community really explicitly, and community-based interventions to violence is what we first called our interventions in creative interventions. Why? Because it was a way of drawing attention and energies away from kind of direct service, professionalized services, and certainly law enforcement, towards thinking about the ways in which communities could assist and aid each other. Part of this was because I saw in working at Asian Women's Shelter for 10 years, and I continue to love that program. I think it's very innovative. And so this is a critique of, I think, the general ways in which most every domestic violence program is shaped in this country, and has a hard time pulling away from. But I saw the ways in which, again, this kind of a liberation or freedom from violence was so tied directly to separation. As Joan says, and as I think all of you know in this restorative justice world, some people, yes, that is what they choose to do, or that's what they find that they have to do in order to escape violence. But so many other people actually want to stay in relationship, even if it's if you look at a family that's been married, even if it's a relationship in which divorce has occurred, but may even have to because they have shared children, may want to because they're still in the same neighborhood, they still have the same friends and community members, may actually want to stay in a closer, more intimate relationship if possible. That is not a model that is at all condoned within the traditional mainstream or most of the domestic violence and sexual violence world. Still today, even for those people who are really trying to look at alternatives, it's a hard one for them to really grasp because there's so much training and honestly experiences in which that looks so dangerous that the only way that some people feel like safety could occur is to actually have physical separation. And the work of doing something where you would stay together is something that's still resisted. And I think that, commend Joan and Gail again for getting in that murky world, for staying in that murky world, and for supporting the rest of us who have been trying to enter that murky world to kind of figure that out. I think the other thing is I'm from the Asian American and Korean American community, that we have many of us have cultural values where what might look at like embeddedness is actually something that is a positive, that we have interconnections, that we care about what our family thinks, we care about what our community thinks. Yes, sometimes at our expense, but oftentimes because that's what gives us value. That's our benefit. And there were so many ways in which we did domestic violence work that broke that and actually devalued that, pathologized it, looked like it was a problem. What your problem is that you care too much about what other people think in your family. What you need to do is think about yourself as an individual. I'm not saying that I'm opposed to that wholeheartedly to that idea, but that was the primary kind of, I think, intervention that was made in terms of, think about yourself. Oh, don't think about them. And then also having kinds of practices where you don't bring people together. Maybe somebody's sister might be somebody that they might benefit from, but you don't have them come to the office. You don't have them come to the shelter. That relationship is separated. The strength of that relationship is not used. For those of us who are in the anti-violence world and really do develop a key knowledge, I think, about dynamics of violence, which are very complex, could be using that to actually talk with families and friends to build up their capacity to actually support people so they could live not in the shelter, but out in their community. That could even interrupt violence, because so many of them already talk with the person who caused harm. But all we want to do is come in and say, well, you should call the police because it's too dangerous to talk with them. While in the meantime, everybody's living with them anyways, and we're not offering any kind of support. So I think that this increasingly people looking at care and thinking of it as not as a caring profession necessarily, but how do we create and nurture and make more explicit the ways in which we have to support care within families, even in violent families where that care is often broken. How can we build on the love that people have for each other? Joan's story was very much, was a great illustration of how that was done in that one family. How is it that we build community ties? How do we build supportive, kind of restorative, transformative practices, and infuse that within people's communities so they have knowledge and they can do that without having to call our lines? And I think many people in this audience probably are doing that already. But these are the things that appeal to me, and that I think that when you bring up, I think just for myself, I want to say, I think I was pretty clear about my history with that term and the limitations I see in using that term. I think the term care has a lot of potential, even for me who hasn't used that term very much. So anyways, I want to thank you for that question, Demonte. I think that it was provocative in many ways, but it's also made me think about things that have been really important, kind of internal and collective discussions that I've been having lately.
Thank you, Mimi, for really opening the conversation about the importance of intentional language in a field where definitions are so vexed. Being really intentional about the language that we use. And also, in the restorative justice world, we talk a lot about relationship and being in right relationship. And to your point, oftentimes we fail to really take relationships and its potential and its power seriously. And there's often separation there. So thank you for speaking to that. And thank you each for answering that, I know, very provocative question. And thank you, Joan, for giving the original framing for that question. We have a little bit of time left. And so I also want to invite folks who are watching live right now to offer any questions or comments that you have from wherever you're watching. We have one, and I hope that you all can maybe take a look at it here. Thank you for highlighting that. Lizzie says, I work at a small college and I'm trying to bring restorative practices to the way we're supporting survivors of sexual assault. What is a way to connect people who do harm to resources and counseling while remaining survivor-centered, which I think is such a big question in the restorative justice field, especially as it relates to familial violence. So Donna, I think you've been voluntold to take this question.
I'm getting a private volunteer. And that's because I've written about using restorative justice in response to campus sexual harm. But this question is so specific because I think in my mind it really speaks to the need for more supportive services for violence assistance, right? It just speaks directly to what I think so many communities need more of. So, we're familiar with batterers intervention programs. Many of those are tied directly to the criminal system in ways that you can't even forget what you think about the content. You can't even get in unless you're referred by the system. That's where the money comes from. So let me just say at the outset, I think there's an issue there. I do think that one of the difficulties in the campus setting that I've seen is that in some locales anyway, there's a tendency to sort of do a cookie cutter approach, to assume that every instance of sexual harm meets a particular kind of definition, to assume that what the facts are. So I think one of the benefits of a restorative approach there is, Sonia Shaw talks about the cause of the cause of the cause of the cause, is that you have a mechanism, you have a means to better get at both what was going on in the mind of the person who caused harm, what their family history, what their individual history is. It's really what I've said about restorative justice before. It's that ability to sort of have a broader lens. So I'll give you some examples of reparative plans that have evolved from practices that I'm aware of. So Nuri Nosrat, who had a program in high school, and who actually, this comes from an interview I did with Nuri that's in that reimagining link you showed, reimagining the movement to end gender violence link you showed at the beginning, Demonte. Talks about a reparative plan, and it included education around sexual harm. It included the young men who were involved in causing the harm, being involved in other kinds of ameliorative things in their school. They had to do presentations and programs. They had to go do research, etc. Some other programs, of course, include, this is not Nuri's example, but other examples include connecting with counselors on campus who have that kind of expertise. If there's very frequently there is an alcohol or a drug issue connected. This is a very, very common connection in sexual harm on campus. And that do that, or who sometimes but very and frequently it's sexual harm is also in the context of peer networks that are reinforcing certain ideas of masculinity and thing-defying, as Joan was talking about women. And so sometimes the intervention has been in those networks to have circles in the networks of whether it's a fraternity or whether it's some other male organization that's a part of that network. I hope that's helpful. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Donna. Joan or Mimi, did either of you want to touch on this question?
I just want to offer some resources. I mean, even though I I am in a university institution. The emphasis of my work has been outside of the university. So, but I know that there's a lot of colleges and universities that are approaching this. I just want to turn you to Spring Up, which is a transformative justice resource that works largely within college and university institutions. And they have a lovely website. They have trainings. And I think that they are very strong in the work they do. Also, Circes Mendez, who does work specifically in, I think, quite a few colleges now, but specifically at Michigan State. And, I just want to really give my condolences to everybody that's really been so harmed by the recent violence at that university. I was thinking of Circes at the time yesterday, but just didn't want to contact her on Valentine's Day with even a message around that level of violence. But Circes, Xhercis, and then Mendez, Mendez, does a lot of really brilliant work within a university context as well.
I should also add that Campus Prism, PRISM, is an organization of administrators and academics who promote restorative justice responses to sexual harm on campus. I'm also happy to be in touch. Anybody can get in touch with me, and I'm happy to talk about it too.
Thank you both.
I just say that was a good question, but also what's behind it is really challenging how universities typically respond to such situations. And so often it's about, not doing anything or separating people from the university. And so this is really, and I think it is restorative, people coming together to figure out how to proceed that acknowledges the history, but it also creates a more caring community on campus for people who have been harmed, for people who have committed the harm. But those categories are not really something that's really distinct. So I just wanted to add that. Oh, and I should say my own university, for a while, I was on the planning committee on restorative processes, and sexual violence was the last thing that they were prepared to deal with.
If I could just mention briefly, I think this has a connection in my mind that I hope will be clear. I recently spoke with Juan Carlos Arian, who's with Futures Without Violence, and he has a roundtable coming up on the development of a national hotline for to assist people who want to not be violent, to assist in desistance. You may probably know of national hotlines that exist elsewhere. And I do think that both hotlines and other forms of support are that are just really needed. So I'll stop there.
Thank you each for offering all of those resources, and the folks behind the scenes there are dropping all of those links. So hopefully folks are getting those. We're almost out of time, but I hope that we can take just a little bit of time to maybe think about the question that Carol Bilson offers. That sort of speaks, I think, Joan, to the distinctness or lack thereof of the categories that you were speaking to. But she asks, should facilitators who work with those who cause harm also work with survivors? Is this ethical and or recommended? So if one of you would like to maybe speak to that from your experience.
Joan, I was looking at you.
I don't think you have the whole picture unless you speak with both parties. I think you'll be much less effective without that understanding. And my work has always been not about pushing people together, respect their wishes, but when they can come together, so much gets resolved. And can I go back to something else, but it also relates to this question of categories and so on. The question about restorative justice, transformative justice, whatever we want to call it. I really think we learned so much from different approaches. So being a Quaker in background, we won't accept money for doing, I'm talking about government money, for doing things because the intent is to be able to keep true to the beliefs and practices of friends. So a lot of kind of my stance comes out of that. So when Mimi talks about her chat project, I love it. And so whenever she would invite myself and Gail to come out, of course, we always went. Donna, what I've always found is you've helped me understand more the beast, and I'll say that of the criminal justice system. And my work has been so much not with the criminal justice system, but trying a lesser extent with the child welfare, but really trying to do work outside of systems. So for instance, the shelter, the family group conferencing. But I think when I say we need all of these, we need to be able to be in community and the caring that Des Moines has pushed us to talk about, and I'm glad he did. But also, and this is Quaker language, and probably quite a number of you use it, is speaking truth to power. And so if you have that community of people that you really have a sense of coming together with, you can then speak truth to power. And so I've always tried to work with different, what can I say, different frameworks. And so far, I know, Des Moines, you are wanting us to have final words. Mine was figure out what works in your context and bring friends together.
Thank you so much for offering. I was just going to say thank you so much for offering your final words. And I want to invite Donna and Mimi to do so as well. What is something that you would really like folks watching or listening today to take away from this conversation? And starting with you, Donna.
I just wanted to say how much Joan's words resonate for me. I am so grateful to be in community with Joan and Mimi. I feel I have learned so much from them, and I'm grateful to be a part of a larger community that's doing this work and having that brings different kinds of perspectives to the work. I feel very grateful for that. So thank you.
Well, so much more to talk about. I would say that I'm not so much in the restorative justice world. I know you have many trainings and an entire school devoted to restorative practices. I know that in my own world, which tends to be around transformative justice, so much of our work is emergent. It's a little bit in response to the last question that we had, that I know for myself, I don't like to have things that are absolutes, that but I think that we have to get wiser about understanding not only the underlying principles, but the ways in which people actually respond to the kinds of strategies that we use, whether you have separate teams, for example, or a coordinator. And these are really important questions. So I appreciate what I think is probably the desire to gain more knowledge. I would say for anybody that discovers something that works, please find a way to document it and share it with the rest of us. There's a lot of more things that are written now. They're not all in some kind of book. Sometimes they're in some kind of zine or pamphlet that you can find online. Transform Harm. I can't remember if it's .org or .com is a great place to get a lot of things on the transformative justice world, healing justice, and let's all keep learning together. Thank you.
Beautifully said, Mimi, and thank you each for, again, your brilliance, your wisdom, and thank you everyone who is watching and listening. The conversation continues. When the recording is posted, please share it in your networks. Please, keep up this conversation, keep asking these critical questions, and keep engaging with the work of each of our speakers and all of the people who are doing really important work around family violence, restorative justice, transformative justice. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.